and welcome to the Illustrious Histories channel. When you hear the words Palace of Versailles, what immediately comes to mind? A glamorous and quite impressive symbol of absolute power given to the Sun King by God. Maybe you imagine modern-day Versailles, a frankly overpriced destination that brings images of tired and weary tourists sweating in a queue line on a hot summer's day. Maybe you think of the hustle and bustle of Louis XIV's court, each and every noble showing an exterior of prestige and etiquette, but secretly lying and poisoning each other, fighting like dogs, just to maybe one day get the incredibly favorable position of putting on the king's shoes in the morning. While the Palace of Versailles is all of these things and more, the more important question is, how did it come to be? It may be called the Palace of the Sun King, but in fact, this palace was not of Louis's creation. The history of this great cultural landmark before the inheritance to Louis XIV is one that's often overlooked by many historians, but the humble beginnings of this palace can give us insight into the many factors of its creation. King Louis XIII, formerly known as Louis le Juste, was born September 27, 1601, during the reign of King Henry. Though Henry IV was a well-mannered king, he possessed many enemies. Chief among them were the very ideological, hardcore Catholic zealots. The anger and hatred towards Henry, whether it was justified or not, has clear evidence in the nearly 18 assassination attempts during his reign. In 1598, Henry issued the Edict of Nantes. This piece of legislation granted toleration towards the Huguenots, but also helped ignite an already tense religious situation. On a late afternoon in Paris, May 14, 1610, Henry IV was to meet with the Duke of Sully, a close advisor and friend who had recently fallen ill. The Duke of Sully's house was located quite close to the then royal palace of the Louvre. The king decided that it was unnecessary to bring a team of horse guards for such a short distance. This mistake would prove to be fatal. The extremely passionate Catholic zealot, François Ravaillac, disgruntled and mad at the king's decision to intervene militarily in the War of the Jolt Succession, spotted the king's carriage stuck on a busy street named Rue de la Fronnière in the modern-day district of La Halle. Ravaillac took the initiative, rushing up to the royal carriage and stabbing Henry 3 times in the heart. He died a day later. Upon the king's death, Louis XIII automatically became king at the young age of only 9 years old. His mother, the famous Marie de Medici, would serve as the royal regent of France until 1614, when Louis became old enough for self-governance. Although his rule was also not without issue, dealing with such problems as the devastating 30 Years' War that ravaged much of Europe and the great religious instability in France, Louis still enjoyed the many leisurely pastimes someone of royal blood could attend: fine meals, the occasional mistress, and hunting, especially hunting. The physical geography of the land the palace was built on is not as picturesque as one would think. The area was in fact rather marshy, with dense woods peppering the fertile landscape. The area was not entirely uninhabited. The Palace of Versailles is named after the original village of the same name, the most widely accepted being that Versailles comes from the Latin word versace, which means keep turning, an expression used since ancient times to describe the act of plowing a field. The earliest date that the name Versailles is referenced in history is the year 1038 AD. Medieval records tell us that by the end of the 11th century, the village centered around a medieval castle and church. Just like any other village during the medieval age in France, it had a series of lords that would visit the king's court and regulate the village taxes. Sadly, none of these medieval artifacts survive to this day. During the bubonic plague and accompanying Hundred Years' War, there seems to be a vanishing of records that indicate that the village had no inhabitants. The title Lord of Versailles was given again in the year 1561 by King Charles IX, when the village had a minuscule population of only 100 inhabitants. The now Renaissance-era village enjoyed relative freedom and prosperity, with annual fairs and even a weekly market on Thursday. And by the end of the 16th century, the population had bloomed from a measly 100 to a serviceable 500. This may seem rather unimpressive to us now, but we must remember that this is a long time before the palace would make it one of the world's most famous villages. For now, farming and hunting would be the village of Versailles' main source of revenue. But not for long. In 1575, after a purchase from Catherine de' Medici, the village would be one of the many possessions of the infamous Gondi family. When the family heard of Louis XIII's legendary love for the pursuit of hunting, they invited him multiple times during the 1610s to their hunting grounds. He found that the large forests in the area produced unusual quantities of game. He also enjoyed the relatively warmer year-round climate compared to Paris. In 1623, he commissioned a hunting lodge on a hill 12 miles west of Paris. This hill gave a good lookout to the surrounding marshlands and forest. He entrusted the architect Philippe Leroy with the construction. Primitive blueprints were written up along with a materials list which included red bricks, stone, and a sturdy slate roof. Keep in mind, hunting lodges were nothing new to European nobility. In a somewhat modern sense, hunting lodges seem to have appeared in northern France during the 11th century, created by the Normans. It is thought that the Normans brought the idea of hunting lodges to England and many other parts of Europe. Even Louis XIII's father, Henry IV, was no stranger to the odd hunt. He had a stunning lodge located in Léon, Père-à-Laty. King Louis may have loved his new lodge, but members of the French nobility were definitely not fond of the new venture. A famous example being François de Bassompierre, one of the king's close advisors. A certain disdain for the lodge and eventually the palace would linger with certain French nobility long after the death of Louis XIII. For 8 years, Versailles served as a fine hunting lodge, a place where King Louis could briefly leave the disease-ridden streets of Paris and enjoy the fruits of nature. While the hunting lodge was quaint, Louis found himself increasingly going on more and more hunting trips and visits. He decided that the building had not fit his expectations. He hired the architect, Philippe Leroy, to build a new chateau. This chateau was commissioned to be built between 1631 and 1633. This would transform the lodge into a palace composed of 3 sections, arranged in a U shape, and endowed with corner pavilions to support the much heavier structure. To accompany the slate, brick and stone was added to the roof. This new palace comfortably fit the king and his entourage, as he found himself increasingly enjoying his stays at Versailles. Important parts of French history were already occurring in the palace's early period. On the 10th of September 1630, Cardinal Richelieu, one of Louis's closest friends and advisors, was at the center of a major political controversy. While the cardinal himself has a very important role in French history, to keep the length of this video tolerable, we will focus on his life at a later date. Suffice to say, Mary de' Medici had taken advantage of a quite serious illness that incapacitated King Louis during this time. She believed the cardinal was exerting too much influence on her son. A sizable chunk of the French nobility were backed by the cardinal's enemies. Louis decided that the only way he could keep his power was to agree to remove Richelieu as superintendent over the house of Mary de' Medici. On the 11th of November, King Louis traveled to the Luxembourg Palace to submit the resignation to the former queen. But little did the queen nor Louis know, the cardinal was not going to go down quietly. During the signing, he interrupted by entering the Luxembourg Palace. King Louis was disconcerted by the sudden appearance. His mother, on the other hand, was incredibly angry. Louis sat there, pale and ultimately speechless, having no clue what to do at a certain moment. Mary de' Medici believed that she had triumphed over the cardinal, thinking that her son's quiet silence was a symbol that he would follow through with the removal of the cardinal. That same evening, the king summoned the cardinal to Versailles, and after a long and private conversation, he agreed to restore the cardinal to the position of minister and to exile his mother, Mary de' Medici. Throughout her life, Mary de' Medici continued the plot against the cardinal until she ultimately died penniless and in poverty in 1642. Enemies of the cardinal now despised the king, and Louis XIII, like his father, would dodge plots against him for the rest of his reign. As the victorious Richelieu returned to Paris, the Count of Sernant made a comment that gave this affair its name. It's the Day of Dupes. This is one of the first major historical decisions that would take place inside the walls of Versailles, and it definitely would not be the last. By 1634, construction on the chateau had been completed. Early Versailles, unlike the more famous late period, rarely if ever held guests or foreign dignitaries. King Louis's wife, Anne of Austria, had her own apartments, but she never slept in them. Apart from hunting, the early palace also contained a location where the king could retreat to when he searched for solitude and peace. He did this most often after his relationship with his mistress, Millie de Lafayette, ended. The palace served the king well until his death. During the winter of 1642 to 1643, Louis began to feel unwell. He managed a few hunting trips to the palace, but his disease gradually got worse into the new year. By the middle of February, he was all but bedridden. Modern historians and scientists hypothesize that he died from intestinal tuberculosis on May 14, 1643, dying on the 33rd anniversary of his father's death. His eldest son, Louis XIV, took the throne at the age of 4. On its own, Louis XIII's reign was one of many accomplishments, not just the building of the palace. He had many political accomplishments as well, from starting the first ever French and Japanese diplomatic relations, to colonial ventures in modern-day Morocco, and doing all this while dodging foreign assassins and ones closer to home in the forms of rebellious nobles. Louis XIII is truly one of history's most fascinating what-ifs. What if he had lived longer? How would that have changed Louis XIV's legacy, and the legacy of the palace? What if he did succumb to the ideas of his mother? Would the monarchy of France ever become absolute? Louis XIII is quite a rare case, a monarch that achieved more than his father, but was outshined by his son, the Sun King. And I will end with a quote from Louis XIII. I would love to see the grimace he is now making in the scaffold. This quote can be seen as a playful nudge to the true unsung heroes of the palace, the workers. Thank you for watching. If content of this nature intrigues you, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. And always remember to stay illustrious.